Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 14th of October. I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, Donald Trump signs his Gaza truce deal to international acclaim, but establishing a lasting peace in the Middle East still looks difficult. The US and China ratchet up trade tensions with tit-for-tat measures targeting the shipping industry. Plus, playing catch-up on AI. Europe striving to claim a piece of the global tech boom, but remains dependent on American firms like Nvidia and OpenAI. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. World leaders signed a Gaza ceasefire agreement brokered by US President Donald Trump, who hailed it as the historic dawn of a new Middle East. There were emotional scenes in Israel where families were reunited with hostages who were taken by Hamas during its October 7th attack 2 years ago. Their release, along with the freeing of Palestinian prisoners, marks the successful first phase of the US plan to end the war. President Trump described it as an achievement 3,000 years in the making.
For so many families across this land, it has been years since you've known a single day of true peace. But now at last, Israelis, but also for Palestinians and for many others, the long and painful nightmare is finally over.
Even Trump's critics and political opponents agreed he had succeeded where others had failed, although some questioned his rhetoric. Many others still have concerns about how the plan will work out in the long term. Officials have yet to lay out a clear plan for disarming Hamas or how to fund the colossal task of rebuilding Gaza. There are also questions over who will run the territory, which is home to 2.2 million people, almost all of whom have been displaced by the war. China has imposed curbs on 5 units of Hanwha Ocean in response to US probes against Chinese maritime logistics and shipbuilding. That's according to a statement from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. It's the latest escalation between the two countries. They're trying to claim they are winning their trade war. Both countries now say the ball is in the other's court to compromise. Speaking yesterday, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says his administration won't back down.
This is China versus the world. They have pointed a bazooka at the supply chains and the industrial base of the entire free world. And, we're not going to have it.
Scott Bessent speaking there. Despite his stance, he also said he believes a planned Trump-Xi meeting will still be on, noting substantial communication over the weekend. Elsewhere, smaller economies are adapting to a world where US consumers and companies are costlier to reach by seeking buyers in Asia, Europe and Africa. The World Trade Organization has revised its forecast for merchandise trade growth in 2025 from 0.9% to 2.4% as governments redraw alliances. The Philadelphia Fed President Anna Paulson has signalled she's in favour of 2 more quarter-point interest rate cuts this year. Speaking at the National Association for Business Economics annual conference, the policymaker said she doesn't see conditions that would turn tariff-induced price increases into sustained inflation.
My base case is that tariffs will increase the price level, but they won't leave a lasting imprint on inflation. And given this base case, monetary policy should look through tariff effects on prices. Why? Let me start with the economics. Here, the lessons from economic theory are clear. So long as expectations are anchored, increases in prices due to supply effects do not turn into an inflation problem.
The Fed's Anna Paulson speaking there. She went on to say that policymakers' decision to cut interest rates by a 0.25 percentage point last month made sense, though a narrow majority of FOMC members favour at least 2 more cuts this year. Others have argued for a cautious approach as inflation remains above their 2% goal. Bank of England policymaker Catherine Mann says Brexit and Liz Truss have made the UK a less competitive and slower growing economy. Speaking at a conference in Philadelphia, the central banker said the UK's vote to leave the European Union was one step in a long erosion of sterling as a global currency. She added that the implications of Brexit meant the, quote, supply side of the economy for the UK is a real challenge. Mann had voted to hold interest rates at the last 2 BOE meetings in an effort to shrink inflation, which at 3.8% is almost double the bank's 2% target. Silver prices have reached an all-time high as traders drive a supply shortage. Spot prices for the precious metal traded near $53 an ounce, beating a record set in the 1980s. Concerns about a lack of liquidity in London have led some traders to fly bars across the Atlantic to profit from higher prices. The squeeze comes as investors globally look for safe havens, with gold also climbing to another record high, building on 8 straight weeks of gains. And SpaceX's Starship successfully lifted off for space on Monday in a closely watched test of its ability to deploy satellites and return to Earth intact. The rocket, billed as the largest and most powerful ever built, completed earlier milestones critical to CEO Elon Musk's aim of preparing it for regular missions into orbit and beyond. Let's take a listen to the moment it launched from the Starbase facility in South Texas.
3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. Go Super Heavy. Go Starship. Thanks for all the historic flights, Pad 1.
Minutes later, the Starship Super Heavy booster split from the spacecraft as planned before splashing down in the Gulf of Mexico. The success marks a step forward in Musk's ambitions to carry NASA astronauts to the moon in under 2 years and eventually establish civilization on Mars. Well, those are your top stories. On the markets, we're looking at European stock futures, lower 0.2 in Eurostoxx 50 this morning. The Nikkei in Tokyo down by 2.6%. The Topix down by 2.2%. Those markets catching up after being closed yesterday. The Hang Seng, though, in Hong Kong is down by 1% as well. So trade movements there having some effect on markets. Gold and silver, we've been telling you about, both significantly rallying today. Gold's up 1.6%, silver's up 1.9% as well. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index 0.1% weaker, and stock futures on Wall Street at the moment are lower too, 0.4 lower for S&P E-mini futures. In a moment, we'll bring you more on events in the Middle East. Plus, can Europe catch up in the AI race? But another story that I've been reading this morning about how the crash in cryptocurrencies played out over the weekend. So some of those US-China trade headlines on Friday sparking a sell-off across many asset classes, but Bitcoin plunged around 13% after those tensions spiked. Bloomberg's Olga Kharif, though, has been writing about how the slump was much steeper in the altcoin market, which are these, as she describes them, ecosystems of speculative tokens that have promised generational wealth through viral memes, big name branding and blind faith in momentum. Well, it seems that blind faith wasn't very well placed when we look at the $131 billion in value erased from those altcoins. That's according to 10x research. Now, this is a sector built on thinner liquidity, speculative narratives and hype, so it is more vulnerable to bigger swings. But Olga's writing that the crash raises doubts about the future of this whole ecosystem. Traders and market makers see structural support for these tokens now eroding with fewer buyers and rising risk aversion. Could this be a freeze for niche meme coins like Dogecoin? You can read Olga's full piece at Bloomberg.com and we'll put a link to it in our podcast show notes. To the Middle East now, where US President Donald Trump talked about a new beginning for the region after the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners under the US brokered ceasefire yesterday. Our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, joins me now for more. Stuart, let's start first of all with how yesterday went. Was this a big success for Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think it was, and I think it would be mean-spirited to say otherwise. I mean, if you think about what he achieved that certainly his predecessor and many other international leaders had failed to achieve over a couple of years, which was ultimately the release of the hostages and also the release of, a couple of thousand Palestinian detainees and prisoners. So just in terms of the kind of the human impact, it was a really big day, I think, and particularly for the region. And then to get that many leaders, and I'm referring, of course, to the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, into a room at short notice, I think speaks volumes to how consequential those actions have been.
Of course, the signing was the big moment. But what sort of plans emerged from that summit in Egypt about what happens next in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at this two ways. I mean, I think you can look at it as a reminder that there is an awfully long way to go to getting true peace, particularly in Gaza, but I would, arguably across the Middle East. But on the other hand, you can view it as, again, summoning and successfully summoning that many leaders from around the world at short notice shows a degree of goodwill, and that will be absolutely essential in terms of hammering out the details of what Gaza looks like going forward, both in terms of the reconstruction and who's going to pay for it, who's going to provide personnel to monitor ceasefires and then to implement them, and then finally, who's going to be involved in formulating a credible governance plan for Gaza going forward.
In the immediate, what should we be expecting next in this process?
So, to some extent now the hard work begins, because it really is a question of hammering out exactly who is going to take responsibility for what, because I think no one who's been observing things over the last couple of years would argue that Hamas is in any position to resume governance, although there have been early indications that they have been trying to reassert control, but I think that's a non-starter for just about everyone. So that probably means some sort of international coalition over the short term, a technocratic government of some sort, hopefully with a strong Palestinian flavour, a reform of the Palestinian Authority, and then as you rebuild those institutions across the enclave, you try and find a way of linking it up with the West Bank, and you try and find a way of bringing or returning economic prosperity, because I think that is the key here. Is it needs a functioning infrastructure and it needs a functioning economy for this to be viable in any sort of time frame.
What does all of this mean for Benjamin Netanyahu? Will he be able to keep a focus on security issues given the other controversies that he has faced in his leadership?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. And to some extent, the landscape has shifted. You can point to a couple of things. There was that somewhat, it would appear, off-the-cuff remark from Trump yesterday in the Knesset, where he urged the Israeli president to pardon Bibi in relation to the trials that he's currently going under. We'll see whether that happens. It's not entirely unprecedented, but it would be extremely unusual. That would remove at least some of the pressure on him. And then it'd be interesting to see what happens at the electoral level. Up until probably a couple of weeks ago, I think it would be very difficult for Netanyahu to secure a win in a future election, which has to take place by October. But you do wonder, with the release of the hostages and the seeming peace, at least for now, in Gaza, whether his electoral fortunes might turn around, and more importantly, whether he would have to rely on that sort of hard right members of his coalition to form a government going forward. So I think, it's something we're going to be watching over the next few months. Very hard to predict which way it'll go, but his fortunes seem marginally better than they were until really quite recently.
Okay, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, who heads up our coverage of the Middle East and North Africa, thank you very much for joining us. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this. Now, European companies are striving to claim a piece of the global AI boom, but they remain dependent on American firms like Nvidia and OpenAI. Across the continent, there are fears that a failure to invest heavily in AI locally will mean losing talent and abandoning yet another tech revolution to Silicon Valley. Our AI reporter Rachel Metz has been writing about this, and she joins us now for more. Rachel, good to talk to you. What did you hear then about these fears from European policymakers and executives?
I think a lot of people are concerned that, as we've seen in the past, there have been case after case where in Europe technology revolutions have come and they have gone, and the continent and the individual countries just have not really been in charge of their destinies with these technologies. We've seen that with mobile, with cloud, et cetera. And with AI, I think people really want to be in charge, especially because they see it as a technology that will play into a lot of different industries and could have a lot of different impacts. It could be, it's necessary for things like healthcare. It could be used in defense, things like that. Especially, when you're talking about things that are really sensitive data-wise, you want to have more control over them as a country.
Is this a lack of investment that's the source of this, or is it just simply that the drivers of innovation in AI are just concentrated in Silicon Valley?
I think there's a few different things going on, and our reporting seemed to indicate that there are a bunch of different factors here. You definitely have a lot of people that are in Silicon Valley, but there's plenty of talent in Europe, in France, in Germany, in the UK, in many other countries as well. And I think a lot of companies are saying, hey, we want to make sure we keep these smart people that we have here. They have people going through their universities, and they want to keep them there, find ways to keep them there, find ways to make it attractive for people to build companies there. And there is definitely investment, but it's true that it is a fraction of what companies collectively in the US are investing. But it's still not an insignificant amount of money that they are investing in AI.
This reporting, Rachel, will cause a lot of hand-wringing in Brussels, where I am, but really in many parts of Europe as well, that Europe wants to avoid becoming a tech colony. Can Europe catch up in this, or is it too late already?
I think that there's a lot of work still to be done, is what it seems like we were finding in our reporting. There is, as you mentioned, investment. There's still a lot of money that needs to be invested. And there's also, I think, a lot of thinking that needs to be done about what are the goals here and what does it mean to have sovereign AI? I think one of the first questions we asked each person we interviewed was, what does sovereign AI mean to you? And it's kind of a squishy term that seems to have a lot to do with control over the sort of start to finish process of AI and of chips and of cloud services and of the models themselves, where they're operated and who's building them and those kinds of things. But you also need to be realistic about the fact that you simply can't do everything yourself, perhaps. And I think there's a number of companies that are trying to make this work in various ways. It's going to be really interesting to see in the coming years how it all pans out.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.